6.
There we go.
7.
Okay.
8. Still waiting for confidence. 9, 10, 11. Ours goes to past 11, 12, 13.
Yeah. The problem
14
with this.
15.
So welcome everyone who's watching the video recording. We are talking today about
17, 20, 95.
About what genres do best in anime, or what genres does anime do best, if you will. That is our topic for the day, and we'll be diving into that as folks filter into the chat room, because
Flash.
Anime is known for handling certain genres better than others. And so we thought it'd be kind of interesting to dive into that a little bit and look into that.
The genres being the categories.
Yeah.
So in standard movies, we have action movies, we have sci-fi, we have comedy, we have romantic comedy, we have drama, we have documentary. I haven't seen too many documentary anime.
No, there are a few, but it's rare.
I've seen historical fiction, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And those are always fun to watch because there's so few of them also.
Yeah.
I learned something to some degree.
And we should point out that genre is an inexact term. You know,
there's things that overlap, that straddle several. You can
sci-fi action.
Sci-fi action,
all that stuff.
Sci-fi with comedy.
Right.
Sci-fi drama.
So we'll
drama action.
We'll recognize that there are various ways of seeing that, and we're going to dive into that interesting question of, is anime, particularly in animation in general, better at representing certain genres than others? And certainly we see some genres more often in anime than in other mediums, I would say.
Yeah. I think anime is better at doing the news than the news is.
How so?
Well, when I watch anime news, I enjoy it.
How would you define anime news?
Well, there's lots of different shows on anime where they parody the news, and it's usually something that's amusing to see how they bypass copy trademark logos. So they're referring to CNN when they say C and N.
Yeah.
Or when they have something similar like that.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually. Is anime particularly good at parody?
Oh,
relative to live action? I think it is.
I think so.
I think partly because it's representational. It is drawn visual art. And so it can parody something. It can give you a visual reference to something very immediately and directly, compared to live action, where there's always that sense that you're watching a new version of something. You're watching somebody sort of bring their own spin to it, whereas in anime you can tell it's parody. They're making fun of it.
How many car chases have I seen already? I know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And this is further complicated by the fact that anime is a combinatorial medium, right? There's a lot of anime that is taking existing character archetypes and character cliches and plot cliches and just combining them in a new way. Or even a not so new way, but just combining them differently than you may have seen before. So sometimes that's parody. Sometimes it's just reference. Sometimes it's just, we're going to do a story with a happy-go-lucky character over here and a sad character over there, and just mash them up and see what happens in that context. And it makes for a different story. So you certainly see. What kind of parody anime have you seen that you particularly enjoyed?
Oh, trying to.
Or anime that's parodied things.
I've seen things parodied in anime more frequently as an aside.
Right, furikuri.
Furikuri is perfect. Perfect example of referring to several different areas of life, and they can slip it in and then go back to their story without spending too much time on it, or sometimes it feels almost like an homage, sometimes less than a parody.
Yeah,
or some way of branding without branding. In like, instead of McDonald's, you see McDonald's. They turn the logo upside down and misspell a few words, and that way they refer to something without getting in trouble or being an official representation. But sometimes they parody outright, and quite often we see shows where they'll parody other genres or the whole genre that they're telling about.
Sure.
So just as a parody show,
right?
There have been so many mecha series. Okay, now we're gonna spoof mecha a little bit.
Martian Succession of Desico being a classic example of that, where they just went full bore with their parody of mecha anime. Yeah,
and some of the romantic comedies, harem. It's been so done that taking it to a new area,
and that's where it gets kind of complicated, because romantic comedies are a good example of one of these very combinatorial genres where you often see similar characters recombined in a new show, and so it's often hard to separate. Are they parodying it? Are they just doing a pastiche? Or are they literally just pulling that character or that character archetype in to see what happens in this situation? You know, you see the same characters that were in Love Hina or Tenchi or whatever, used again, and you have to wonder, well, what are they kind of doing with that? One famous example of that was when was with Full Metal Panic, where Full Metal Panic is it can be a very serious mecha show, but well, depending on which series you're watching, it can be very comedic. It's basically a comedic concept, and they took this same basic hero as Hiro Yui in Gundam Wing, the serious child soldier, and put him in a comedy. So what happens when you have the very dour child soldier who just executes his mission without caring about what happens, and put him in high school, having to protect a girl and also give him access to a gun? Things end badly. So it's a cute idea, but then it becomes the fundamental sort of ethical question or moral question of the show, which is how do you relate to a character like that? How do you kind of redeem a character like that who has been severely traumatized? How do you interact with that person in a way that respects him? And how can he fit into society when he has been so badly damaged as a person? So it's kind of a parody. It's definitely a parody, but then it becomes its own thing.
So it uses the parody as a premise for the rest of the story.
Exactly.
So parody, in that sense, is an aspect, but not the entire genre. And so we see a lot of things like that overlap. There's certain elements in some shows of comedy, but they're also a sci-fi story. Tenchi, Space Dandy, stuff like that. There's comedy elements to it. There's little bits of romance. You look at something like Cowboy Bebop, there's so many different aspects to it. So there's espionage, there's government, there's adventure, there's space, there's sci-fi, there's romances and backstories, and that is some of that depth is, I think, what adds flavor to a story. And if there's enough depth, it really becomes popular.
So let's pull that back to our topic, which is about genre. What genres does anime do best? People talk a lot about the depth of anime. Do you think anime does better at adding depth to stories than, let's just say, other animation? Like traditional animation in America, CGI in America, things like that. Is anime deeper as a whole?
I think it has gone deeper. I think American animation has potential, but doesn't exploit the depth that is available to it. There's always exceptions to the rule, but on the whole, that which is consumed by most Americans of American anime doesn't go as deep as some of the Japanese animations. That's not to say there aren't shallow Japanese animations.
Oh yeah,
there's plenty of those, but there's a lot of Japanese animation in relation to U.S. animation. They have a tendency to take it in areas where U.S. animation has not traveled. The slice of life genre is rarely investigated in U.S. animation, and that's something that we see a whole category, a whole genre, so to speak, of slice of life. Now they may have different aspects to them, but they're when they're considered slice of life, most of those are more realistic in their nature, showing real scenarios and real life interactions that are less something that you need animation for, but it augments it.
Well put. Well, and we were talking about this before, I think slice of life is a genre that anime does particularly well. Because you do see that so often, and you do see so many fans talking about how much they were affected by those slice of life shows, how much they felt like they were there with those characters, how much they cared about the characters, even in shows that nothing's going on, using scare quotes there, where it's about a group of, random high schoolers going about their lives, and, they don't go to nationals, they don't travel across the world, they just kind of have their in and out lives. But anime can represent that in a way that is emotionally involving. Why do you think that is?
To some degree, identification with the characters, but sometimes I find there's a cultural difference, and certain cultural differences are a little bit harder to understand, but in anime, it kind of I can kind of accept it more because I know the background, Japanese background, and so it always kind of lingers in the back of my mind when I get to talk to somebody who's lived in Japan or Japanese nationals. Hey, do you guys still cut the buttons off? No, that's an old thing. Only the old people do that, and even you're referencing that makes you sound like an old man. Oh, okay. I guess that anime was older, but
and I think that is an important element where Japan has Japanese culture has a respect for the everyday, and a lot of celebration of the everyday in its culture, in its in holidays, in literature, and all sorts of things. There's very much this focus on appreciating everyday common aspects of life, the birds in the air, the flowers on the side of the road, and this goes back hundreds of years. And obviously, culture is a broad thing, and people are different. But because you see that so often, I think in Japanese culture, it carries over into this ability to showcase normal everyday life in anime and make it feel vibrant, right? It doesn't feel special. That's the interesting thing. They don't take the everyday and suddenly make it feel hugely dramatic. They make it feel, powerful and effective just in being what it is.
That's something that really makes me think. And the topic of what are the genres that anime does really well. There's one thing that you see through several different anime genres is the cultural education that goes on, showing people sites and locations and traditions and just all sorts of different cultural experiences that anybody who's not Japanese would never pick up on. Those are some of the things that are added in, and sometimes it's subtle, as somebody eating ramen, and sometimes it's really clear and obvious. I remember seeing Big Sight on an anime, the International Convention Center in Tokyo, and I thought it was neat show, crazy looking building. That's anime. And so I was looking around online, and I said, "Oh my goodness, that looks like the building I saw in the anime. It really does exist." And then I started looking at all these other references. Oh yeah, okonomiyaki is really a dish. It's really from Osaka. Yeah, people from Osaka do speak with an accent. Yes, there are some differences, and so there's a lot that's slipped in that I just can't take everything for granted that it's just fiction and animation. Some things obviously like the space aliens or people going into chibi mode, although I've seen some people who almost look chibi. In the so there's a number of
yeah. Well, and that gets to the point that there's a great story there where I'm a big fan of the Digimon franchise. And the thing about that franchise is that it can be very It's very kid focused, and so it can be very fantastic. For season 3, I watched the series, and it's set more in the real world, apparently. And I enjoyed that. And then I went on to the writer's website where he showed a lot of the behind the scenes materials for it. And he showed the photographs they took of going around Tokyo and the various neighborhoods where those kids live. Ooh. Everything in that show was very much set in the real world in very specific locations. And because they said they wanted kids to feel like this could happen to them, like this had reality. And it was so strange to be looking at photographs of things that I had seen as backgrounds in anime, right?
It does exist.
Yeah, and I thought, okay, that's an interesting building, but it really does exist in reality. And more than that, they were trying to get across the feeling of reality, the feeling of actually being there, which gave me an extra appreciation for the show that, oh, I wasn't just being shown random buildings. I now have a sense for what that neighborhood looks like. And I think that's something that anime does a lot. You see that in Haruhi Suzumiya, for example. Haruhi feels like a particular place in Japan. And Kyoto Animation, the studio that makes that, they spend a lot of time trying to find real locations that, that they use as basis for those shows. If you've seen K-On!, it's based on a real school building. They actually went and, all the different elements there you'll see in that actual school building. So yeah, there's that, I don't know, sense of reality.
Yeah, it's weird. In Tokyo, I remember passing by a Shinto, or by a temple, with the typical red archway
Torii gates, yeah.
And oh my goodness, it was wedged in between 2 skyscrapers in a business district. Yep. So these kind of things really did, and it's people sitting out underneath the sakura, drinking. For of course it was a little cold then, so there weren't as many people. But.
Yeah, totally. And now Liquidus in the chat room points out that anime does psychological and these very sublime anime like Lane and Evangelion, where you can show a lot of weird things on screen, and they seem weird until you realize it's actually a point to those images. There's actually somewhere going. And I agree. We were talking about this
abstraction
before the show started. Yeah,
abstraction. That's an area of anime that I can really appreciate, and you can get everything from super realistic to super abstract. If you think of there's a Space Dandy episode where he goes to a plant planet, and it's just so abstract. Unless you're really into it, I could see it being too abstract for a lot of viewers. But then you can get something that's almost a manga-esque in the amount of detail in faces. And so it ranges sort of in the same way comic books can, with the amount of detail. So there's a certain abstractness that you can get into. And one thing is having characters almost, or movements represent as a symbol those movements.
And anime has all sorts of visual shorthand. When somebody is embarrassed for somebody else, they get a giant sweat drop on their forehead. When they're feeling a little bit excited, nosebleed.
The Randy section.
And we all know that nobody, if they feel that way, they don't literally get 2 streams of blood coming out of their noses. That just doesn't happen. But it's this simple visual way of getting across something that's actually fairly subtle. Like, how do you get that across in animation without a very obvious reference, which I think we can all think of? But that is a quick way of throwing us into the character's head that anime is very effective at, because they're willing to give you that visual shorthand. I think it's very important.
There was another abstract dandy going to a library. And so it can particularly do science fiction well, because you've already bought into the animated realm. So the idea of special effects can be animated easily without the viewer saying, oh, that was just a bad effect. I can buy the story, but that effect ruined it. No, you've already bought into the story, so the effects kind of flow with it. usually.
It's a very important point that animation, because everything is in the same visual style, it's much easier to buy into everything seen in that visual style as opposed to live action. There is a term for that, which I'm forgetting. And it's absolutely been noted that animation is good for that.
Yeah, the contract of belief, contract of disbelief, I think is one term I've heard for.
Yeah.
You suspend your disbelief.
And actually, I wanted to point out. So, speaking of abstraction, one other thing anime does interestingly is they will mix different levels of abstraction. So I'm watching Fruits Basket right now, and one of the jokes in Fruits Basket is various of the characters turn into animals when they're hugged by a member of the opposite sex. And it's got a fairly standard visual style for the characters in human form. When they turn into animals, it's very abstract. It's almost just like a cookie cutter outline with an eye in there. And on the one hand, it's cute. They look adorable. It's just these little cute little shapes. But on the other hand, it really gets across how different they are. It gets across the fact that, they're not just animals. This is a pure version of that person. And it gives the mind somewhere else to go instead of remembering, oh, this person's a dog. No, they are in a different form.
That's one thing that animation is really good with in general, generally in animation. But specifically anime does that quite a bit. The whole transformation and if it was a live action show or something on TV or movie, you'd look at the effect. And you'd say, well, that dog is pretty well behaved for for being on the set. They must have had a really good trainer. But when you watch anime, you can believe that Ranma actually turns into a girl. You can believe that people have powers that they can transform into, and you don't say, oh wow, the makeup artist was so I'd say fantasy and science fiction are a really strong point for anime, because it can be done at the same budget as something that's not the amount of dollars put into doing a believable fantasy are probably less for anime than they are for a real action or Hollywood film.
And that's a really good point, that everything in animation is animated. So it costs just as much to have a sword as to have a staff, as to have a gun, as to have anything else. So putting aside the fact that you have different animators having different skill sets and, making it easier or harder to draw those objects, that does enter into it. Having somebody swing a sword is just as cheap as anything else, or a lightsaber or what have you. So it does make fantasy and science fiction a lot easier to do.
Would you subdivide the genres of fantasy and science fiction, or would you consider that one collective? Because there have been a lot of different directions of sci-fi and fantasy, some directed towards space, some directed towards castles and dragons, some directed towards biogenetics, some directed towards alien life forms or ancient pasts or spirits or psychic forces. Or
a lot of folks like the term speculative fiction.
Speculative fiction
as that sort of umbrella term for science fiction, fantasy, horror, etc. Personally, I find it helpful to maintain the distinction between science fiction and fantasy, recognizing there's overlap, but there's overlap in everything. But I do think that there is a lot to be said for saying that there is a larger term for, fiction about things that aren't real, for lack of a better term.
So there's a lot of overlap in multiple genres. We see with Tenchi Muyo.
Tenchi's.
It's a harem
all over the place.
It's a harem story as well as science fiction.
As Liquidus points out in the chat room, does any other medium do harem?
Ooh.
Can you think of another medium that does harem in the way that we think of in anime? So obviously there are other shows where there is one guy and multiple girls, and multiple female characters. But do you see other mediums which mine this idea of one guy and lots of other girls who could be his girlfriend, reasonably, potentially. I certainly don't see it anywhere else.
I don't recall. I don't recall any.
Yeah,
they really do that. That seems relatively unique to anime.
Yeah, and granted, anime is arguably aimed primarily at young men of a certain age and a certain marital status for whom that is a convenient fantasy.
It seems that has been gradually changing as we see reverse harem.
True.
And a lot of anime aimed at women who are interested in boys love, basically. So,
yes.
But then there's a larger audience now for that in both genders.
Sure.
So it seems like there's some interest. It's expanding.
Well,
in its age group and its gender demographic.
Well, and of course, as anime evolves, we're also seeing the harem itself evolve, where there's now less of a focus on the man plus the 6 cute girls into there's also a science fiction premise. There's some classroom crisis is a great example of that, where there are boys and girls around and there's kind of romance and such, but it's more about all the different relationships between them in this sort of classroom environment. And with a lot of the visual novel stuff, we're now seeing there being more of a heavy story going on instead of just will they, won't they. It's characters.
It's nice to see the interaction between personalities, the emotional entanglements, the strategic, just the relationships between the characters, and more than just sort of a fan service style approach.
Now, Liquidus brings up a good point. Liquidus is our third host here, which is that would there be a stigma against making harem in the U.S. because the U.S. is more about monogamy and things? And this brings up an interesting point that we were talking about a while back, that it's funny how you'll have these shows with this, sometimes a lot of fan service in it, but it never goes anywhere. Right? Nobody actually ends up in bed with anyone else in the vast majority of these shows, unless you're going into straight porn.
Frustration.
Exactly. With some interesting exceptions. So it's interesting how, on the one hand, you do have this will they, won't they against all these characters, but it is ultimately a very conservative story almost all the time because they never choose. So there is no actual threatening to that sort of that monogamy. And granted, Japan is by all accounts a country where
semi-sexually repressed. In
public,
but in private.
Well, but also it's about the relationships between married people. Once you get married, there has been a long tradition of turning a blind eye to certain liaisons while married, but that has to be, that you must keep that blind eye turned, i.e. you don't push, neither side makes a big deal out of that. It can stay on the side as long as it stays on the side. So it's a little more complicated than that.
Different sexual cultural dynamic.
Right. So the monogamy is very much respected, with the caveat that these things happen on the side, but just out of sight. So it is very different than it is over here.
That can ruin your.
Oh, totally. So I don't know. I don't know if it would be a big deal in the U.S. because nothing ever happens of it. But then we have our own weird hangups about sexuality, as we it is the stereotypical complaint that we can show people getting their heads blown off, but we can't show a nipple.
That brings me to the idea of another genre, which we don't usually discuss too much here, of hentai.
Yeah.
There's certain areas of hentai that anime does particularly well, and different subgenres of that and related things that are simply not possible in the physical world.
Yeah.
And don't exist, and there's no way that could ever exist.
And let's say it, there's way more animated pornography in hentai or in anime than in any other animated medium.
Yeah,
no other country is doing this.
Yeah, so I have to say, as a genre, it's successful.
Yeah,
it's got viewers, it's got content, it's got sales.
There are dozens of new hentai every year.
It's got fans. It's got
and it has long-running franchises. Maybe perhaps franchise is a big word for it, but series, continuing series,
franchises. Even I would lean to franchises.
Yeah, I mean, Urtsuka Doji was arguably a franchise. So yeah, there's certainly that out there, which is unusual. And what's also remarkable is that hentai can, again, do those things that are physically impossible, but also do the things that maybe you wouldn't want to do in real life.
Keeping fantasy as fantasy and indulging in it without engaging in it.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's certain certain dynamics that go with that too.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly hentai involving characters that you could not legally put together in real life. Let's just put it that way. So
legally for copyright purposes, or legally for age differences,
yes,
or
yes, all of
or both.
Above. Yes, which is just an interesting thing. It makes it different. So yeah, I think those are all certainly genres that anime does quite well, and very unusually. Onichichi is a hentai series where there are more episodes every so often. It's a couple episodes long, I believe, but yeah, there are new. Oh no, there are a couple of different Onichichi storylines, if you will. So yeah, it's one of those things where there's demand.
It seems that there's not a lot of straddling the two categories. I'm sorry. Pardon my pun.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
It seems that a lot of anime goes up to fan service, treats sex as something that will never happen for the guy. He's just going to stay eternally frustrated and never, and for the girl, and they're always going to struggle with their frustration and never reach. Or it's the reverse, where it's all the time, and there's there's no happy in between. There's no. I mean, it seems that. Of course, I can't say anything for the U.S. market, but in movies, there's a gradient, and you can see something that's R-rated that obviously has sexual connotations, but doesn't go into pornography, but refers to sex, that people actually do have it.
Sure, yeah.
And so it seems like almost a dividing fence in anime between what's in the area of hentai or pornography versus something you could air on TV.
Well, and it's complicated by the fact that so much anime is aimed at that younger audience. Liquidus brings up shonen in the chat room, that shonen is aimed at this, tween and young teen audience. And so it's going to be very difficult for anyone to make a show to that audience and then show people, screwing around, so to speak.
The mothers would call.
Exactly. Well, famously, that happened with Evangelion, which was a shonen series where they had a scene in which that happened, and mothers complained. Although when you hear about the mothers in Japan complaining and about PTA audiences complaining, there's more to it than that. But that's a whole nother show. So yeah, it's interesting. There's some weird there's that weird dividing line. Now, shonen is an interesting topic. You do see these stories of, for lack of a better term, kids with powers that are in a quasi fantasy world, right? Sometimes more or less, but like Yu Yu Hakusho is the real world with demons running around in it. Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z are definitely a fantasy science fictional world, but it doesn't go too crazy into, imagining what life would be like in the future or things like that. Fairy Tale is a fairly standard fantasy world. So you have this really unusual thing that you don't get in other mediums much. You don't see that sort of quasi fantasy.
There's a category that I would like to see develop more in anime, and that's the area of telling old stories. Passed down from generation. We have Grimm's fairy tales and traditional folk stories. And it doesn't seem that there are a lot of different series that tell these old folk tales. And so when a reference is made in an anime to some story that every Japanese kid grew up with, I'm thrown for a complete loop because I have no frame of reference. And sometimes I won't recognize the story that they're referring to. After I've seen enough anime, I can realize there's some story that they're referring to with this, this character, the monkey guy who's doing this, but they haven't really taken it to the level where every kid's. Well, I mean, they're shooting for a Japanese audience, so they don't have to. But I'd like to see anime take it there because not every kid is going to have that same repertoire.
Oh, just like Orihime.
Orihime.
What?
How? What?
Yeah, and that's what happens. They, they get this off reference, and nobody can understand it.
Oh. Where's my cough button? Let's see.
Sorry. Dark Devil makes the excellent point that Harry Potter is rather shonen in its own way.
Quite.
You have kids with fantasy powers. I would say 007 is not shonen because he's not a kid,
but his audience.
Well,
I see.
His audience is that. But I mean,
he
is a real person, although they pushed that a lot in recent movies. But I would argue that he is not quite shonen. But there's certainly similarities. There's certainly parallels. I'll put it that way.
Now, would a poor guy who's never grown up be considered shonen then? So let's say an otaku is shown who's in college. Okay. Would that be Genshiken? Would that be considered? I mean, it's more slice of life, but would that be if it's aimed at a shonen age group? Would that be considered shonen, even if the characters are not shonen? At what point do we say the viewer versus the content?
And which gets to the point where there are kind of two kinds of shonen. There is shonen the demographic, and then shonen the genre, right? There is a common term in the West for shonen anime, which refers to Bleach, One Piece, Fairy Tail, Dragon Ball Z, which are about youths with powers. And then Dragon Ball Z, granted, they're mostly adults. But youths with powers in some sort of quasi fantasy world where it's a team fighting something, right? Naruto, etc. But then there's lots of shonen that doesn't fall into that pattern, right?
So we have Spider-Man, who's youth who suddenly gets powers and fights eventually. There's the whole comic book Marvel thing, but I don't think we've explored it in the same way that Japanese anime has taken that and formed it into an entire genre.
Right. Well, and there's the whole aspect of different ways in which those themes are explored. So, for example, Spider-Man and X-Men and other Marvel stories tend to be more about isolation and about how your powers make you different, whereas shonen tends to be more about learning how to use your powers as a group.
Cope with this.
Well, it's becoming part of a group, right? It's learning how to function as somebody. What is Naruto's goal in Naruto? It's to become the Hokage, to become the leader, and which is a very social goal.
That seems to be sort of an effort that's found in the culture, in the Japanese culture at large. When you look at things like sports day, field day, there are team efforts to do activities and not as many individual personal achievement. It's the collective. Okay, my team, I'm working for my team. And you see that on lots of projects.
I've just been reading Anime and Philosophy, and there's a great essay in there about which is a book, by the way, Anime and Philosophy. There's an essay in there about that analyzes the typical shonen concept that I fight to better myself. the reason I am in this, the reason I'm fighting is because I want to fight people more powerful than I am, which will make me more powerful, which will make me better as a fighter. And you see that over and over in anime. Folks are constantly seeking out more powerful opponents to get them better. Vegeta in Dragon Ball Z is kind of the canonical example. And the essay analyzes, is that psychologically healthy? And is that even effective?
Wow.
Does that actually make you better? Does it set you up for failure? All these various things. So it's an interesting thing to sort of think about. But you do see this often, where there is this purity of intention to those characters, where they're into fighting purely to better themselves.
That does sound like a better approach to fighting than the revenge motive.
And it's interesting because you contrast that with, say, superheroes. They very rarely are looking for other opponents to fight, right? They are there to stop crime or to stop a villain, or as Liquidus said, the Roger Moore 007.
So a justice motive rather than a sport motive.
Exactly, right. Which is just, again, just kind of a different cultural spin on the medium or the genre.
It's interesting that you brought that up. I remember reading about a philosophy that athletes had in the Olympics during the Soviet era, when the U.S., the Cold War era, the U.S. and the Soviets, Soviet Russia, had a big competition between them for everything. And of course, it all comes to a head during Olympics.
Yeah.
And eventually one of the people came out with the idea that competition is a bad thing.
Oh, yeah.
At least here in the US, they were saying, oh, this is terrible. But one of the interviews with the Soviet athletes, they said, we were brought up to view competition as a very good thing, because when you work against somebody who's better than you, you get better. When you better yourself, the others get better. Everybody kind of benefits from the healthy competition, which is a different perspective than the ground your opponent. It's the we're the adversary directive, which I thought was a very enlightened perspective, which takes it back into the form of sportsmanship rather than defense, justice, stuff like that.
Well, and what this essay starts talking about is the fact that it gets unhealthy when it becomes focused on the other person, right? When you have to beat John or Goku in this case, you have to be better than Goku. Well, maybe you don't have Goku's body. Maybe you just can't get there. So when that becomes your obsession on something that you can never achieve, that can be way more damaging to you than a focus on getting better, right? You can beat your own goals as opposed to beating him. Now, on the other hand, you can certainly see use other people as that stepping stone. But there comes a point when it becomes an obsession on the person. And again, the essay is not saying this is right or wrong. It's saying it's something to think about. It's a philosophical conundrum.
It's definitely something that I think of when I see characters, because the character who's motivated by revenge usually comes to a point where they have to figure out, is the revenge worth it?
Yeah.
And the character who's trying to better themselves comes to a similar point, but being able to assess whether it's the self-propelling versus the payback, the balancing of everything, it is really an interesting thing to observe when you watch characters, and what is their real motivation. And it can vary from genre to genre.
And that's another thing I think that anime does, at least more often, if better, is that focus on the character's motivations and the character's personal motivations, as opposed to sort of larger themes. Dark Devil brings up in the chat room that in comic books, those superheroes tend to talk about big themes, about justice. I'm doing this for these big moral reasons. Whereas in anime, the characters usually have much more personal reasons for what they do. And so you get to understand where those characters are coming from and understand those often very fragile human viewpoints on things, whereas American superheroes tend to be about more abstract concepts that they're trying to embody, they're trying to show off. One of the great moments in American comics was the crossover between Green Lantern and Green Arrow in the 70s, I believe, when they were walking along and doing one of these debates they would do back and forth. And one of them, I forget which one, says, you have to uphold the law. And the other says, but what if the law is wrong?
Ooh, the struggle.
Exactly. And so, and that's a great example of how superheroes kind of debate these and show these things off in how they do things. It's a lot of the appeal of superheroes, these big themes. Whereas in anime, we tend to see about these specific people where, Vegeta wants to beat Goku. That's his motivation. It's very simple and straight. It's not about saving the world. And in Naruto, it's about this kid who has been, pushed aside all of his life and wants to prove that he is a worthy member of that culture. Just a very different focus on the character, which is kind of interesting considering that Japan is a stereotypically much more about the group than about the person, but anime tends to focus on those personal
Do you
views.
think that part of that is the collective consciousness of the country dealing with what they haven't dealt with outwardly, and maybe the U.S. is dealing with these subjects through their the symbolism of their superheroes, because the public viewing of this is something that they haven't done personally?
Quite possibly.
Just sort of the inside out, outside in.
Right.
Theory.
Yeah. Well, and that would be an interesting thing philosophically. I mean, many people say that Americans tend to think first or act first, then think later. And so maybe our superheroes are bringing up these larger moral, ethical issues that we tend to ignore in the favor of action. That would certainly be an interesting way of looking at it. Whereas maybe in Japan, the opposite is true.
A very shonen character to act, then think.
Yeah, totally. Now, Liquid asks whether mecha, the relationship between mecha and shonen. That's an interesting question. I would say the large majority of mecha is shonen in the demographic sense. Certainly, it's aimed at tween and young teens. But then the question is it shonen in that sense of dealing with those shonen themes? And I think often it is, sometimes it isn't. We do seem to get a lot of things with dealing with themes of growing up in mecha. Mecha is often about coming into being an adult,
coming of age. I'm a kid. I have responsibilities. I have to fit into this. How am I going to grow to or not? Oh, I can't go back. I got to go forward. And now I've developed all this experience. I'm the mature one here now, and I've got to lead.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot to it. And you certainly see that a lot more, I think, in anime than in other genres, that focus on that coming of age in a way that makes the person a functioning member of society as opposed to other things.
We have a huge category that we haven't even addressed yet.
Yeah.
Magical girl.
Ooh, excellent point.
How many magical girls? There's some that you see in the US, but anime.
Yeah.
Volume.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, magical girl is certainly. So what makes magical girl
magical? No.
Yeah.
Girl.
What makes it distinctive in a thing that anime does well? Would you say?
Good question. My background on magical girl is, I have to say, is limited, and I'd like to expand it more. So I'm still learning about that area. The whole concept of a familiar was not familiar to me until I started investigating, and perhaps you could explain a little bit about the genre magical girl.
So first, let's talk about the basic parameters of the average magical girl series, if you will. You have an average, usually rather clumsy, ordinary girl who is actually not so ordinary. There's something about her past usually that's a little unusual. And then a magical familiar shows up and tells her how to access magical powers, almost always through the use of some catchphrase, whereupon she transforms into some kind of outfit and then fights monsters or people who have been changed or some other thing that needs to be defeated that week. And do that for 50 episodes. Wow. And you get that kind of over and over again of this girl who's been chosen to fight some magical menace. Now, what's particularly interesting about that, and one of the things I think that does make it unique that you don't see elsewhere, is it is a show with a young female protagonist. Very few other mediums, just period, have stories with underage, I mean, just in the sense of, under 18, female protagonists, where they do stuff and they are the focus of the story. Even in young adult literature, while you will have female protagonists and they may have powers, you don't see stories in which, with this kind of regularity, with this specific structure in it, there may be sort of a girl Harry Potter. You may have sort of kind of the Hunger Games where she has this unusual ability, but it's different. It's very different. So yeah, I think Magical Girl is unusual if just because it has lots of strong young female protagonists, which we just don't get a lot in other places.
Now, in some live action, I'm sure I've seen some Disney shows that have that, but Disney's demographic is the younger audience, so they do have female protagonists.
Yep.
But just the sheer volume of Magical Girl series outweighs, like we say, there's an exception to every rule.
Yeah.
It's a whole genre.
Well,
in anime where it's just sort of a show here and there.
And let's not forget what we mean by strong female character. We don't simply mean a character who can pick up a sword. We mean a character who makes decisions, moves forward,
thinks for herself.
Something you don't see a lot in Disney princesses. You see some. I'm not slagging off on Disney princesses, but it's something that the Disney has often struggled with, is finding female characters, central female characters who act on their own behalf, and don't sort of move along there. And yes, as Liquidus says, there are certainly crossovers between Magical Girl and Super Sentai. Super Sentai, which is Power Rangers, or Power Rangers is an example of, has certainly influenced Sailor Moon. Or Magical Girl. Sorry, not all Magical Girl is Sailor Moon. My mistake there.
But that's probably most people's familiar exposure to Magical Girl, is it not?
Certainly. It's certainly over in the West. Sailor Moon is unquestionably the biggest Magical Girl to make it over here. Which gets back to that point of parody, actually. We've had quite a bit of Magical Girl, Cardcaptor Sakura is definitely a Magical Girl parody, which we got over here. And a lot of folks didn't understand it was parody. One of the difficulties they had putting it on television over here is the parodic elements, which they tried to show in the show, but folks were like, why are they?
Yeah, unless you have a background of what they're parodying, you think it's serious, in which case everything's misinterpreted. That's the tricky thing. But parodies are so much fun and I've seen plenty of parodies where I have no idea what they're making fun of, but it's funny. And when I finally do get a chance to see some of the stuff that's being parodied, it's even more funny. But reception is everything.
And it's a great example. I mean, I think Cardcaptor is a great example too, where, so one of the parodies in there is that Sakura, the main character, she doesn't actually transform. She has these cards, these magical cards she's collecting, but she has no transformation sequence. But she has this best friend who really likes to sew. So every time Sakura goes out to capture a card, her friend Tomoyo brings along costumes and insists that she changes into a new costume. And like every episode, there's a new costume she has to put on. And so here's the thing. And Tomoyo just really likes that they're best friends. To an American, that's dang creepy. That this 10-year-old girl is forcing this other girl to change her clothes all the time. It just seems weird until you understand this sort of joke about the transformation sequence. So again, it comes over to America and folks are just scratching their heads thinking, what's going on between these two little girls? So it's where the communication breaks down a little bit. And as Dark Devil points out, it's about having, it's about female relationships. It's about having multiple girls talking with each other about their own issues and kicking ass together, which is kind of nice. And in Liquidus, there's a magical girl, and I forget the name too, but where she has to actually literally find a place to change clothes.
What does Superman do with his clothes? I never see a pile rumpled there. Where does he put them?
Always wondered that. Yeah, at least Batman changes in the Batcave and then goes out. Kind of silly. Well, and to that point, one of the things Magical Girl does are these kinds of abstractions. So obviously, the Magical Girl is not literally changing in real time. The bad guys aren't sitting there for 30 seconds while she goes through a transformation sequence.
She's spinning around. She's naked. Strike now.
Yeah, right. That is all an abstraction for the fact that she is switching modes into this more sort of physically powerful version of herself, and her powers are activating. So there's that symbolism you see in anime that you don't see as much in, say, Disney style animation, where you have all of these stretching of time that you see in anime that you don't see in other places as much. Look at Frozen. Frozen happens pretty sequentially.
Real time,
stuff just happens.
Not outside of the universe as we know. Or yeah,
and contrast that with Evangelion, for example, where they're constantly squashing time, jumping around to different points in time.
Very nonlinear in its direction.
And it's something that anime seems to be able to do, and that's an interesting element too, where there's things that anime can do because of its history, less because of its the limitations or lack thereof of the medium. Otaku and people who are used to anime are used to changing time.
There's a precedent for it. It occurs all the time in this medium.
So they can get away with it, if you will, where they couldn't get away with it in other places.
Well, let's see. We've covered stuff aimed at guys, stuff aimed at girls, stuff aimed at adults. How about kids shows?
Oh, there's a good topic.
Doraemon,
yes. Crayon Shin-chan, all those others.
Of course, Crayon Shin-chan's sort of the Bart Simpson. So depending on the age of the viewer, he may be a good or bad influence. The butt dance.
Yeah, well, and there's certainly a lot of anime aimed at kids. This is one of the things a lot of folks don't understand is how much anime is aimed at kids that we just never get.
Yeah.
There's just lots of these weird little Sergeant Frog.
Sergeant Frog is fun.
It's crazy, and lots of, and again, a very parody heavy show where if you don't understand Gundam, like what's going on here? Why is he assembling all these plastic model kits? Why is that a deal? And there's a lot of those shows for kids, and but they're very aimed very differently. Now, Liquidus asks, what about shows
More
that don't take themselves
teen
seriously
and young adults themes, because they reference stuff that in their display.
Yeah, so things like Furikuri or Kill la Kill, where they don't take themselves too seriously. Excel Saga being an example. Those are actually, I would consider, anime aimed at otaku.
That's a genre I'd like to see more of, because it takes it into abstract. It parodies. It has comedy. It has serious moments. It has non-serious moments, and yeah, those are fantastic.
Yeah, Haruhi Suzumiya, another good example of that. There is this whole genre for shows where folks they're focused on folks who know what you're talking about, and that gets even more complicated because you do get these things where you have to be educated in the abstractions and the symbolism to understand everything that's going on. You can certainly watch Haruhi and enjoy it, but you're not really going to get the jokes about Moe and the jokes about her big Mikuru's breasts unless you've seen all these other different shows and things.
Just like with other parody, if you don't know what's being made fun of, you may not get the joke until later on. And he who laughs last didn't get the joke.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So there's that interesting intersection of shows where anime can get away with it because we have 50 years of this stuff and folks have been watching it for that long.
That is nice for a creator and designer because they're not confined by certain restrictions. They can take the story to an area where live action dare not go.
It's also one of the reasons why I think anime can be or can feel so deep and can feel so different, because like Fruits Basket is again a good example where one of the unusual things they do is that they ignore a lot of the standard tropes of the romantic comedy genre, where girl finds out somebody's secret, and she's just like, oh, it's fine. I'm everything's cool. I'm not going to spoil the secret. We're fine. And the guy's like, okay, good, sweet. And they just move on from there. There's no drama surrounding that. There's no will they, won't they. There's no temptation. That's just accepted, and we move on because we've seen that trope enough that the creators feel like we don't have to explore that here. Something that would be very easy for other stories to explore, you don't see. Going back to Digimon Tamers earlier, one of the things they do differently is that the kids' parents find out what they do fairly early on in the story. So they find out that they got these creatures that they're going off and fighting, in alleyways to save the world. In most other shows, what would happen? The adults are going to take them aside and say, no, you can't do this. No, you're not going out there. The kids are going to have to find. And in Digimon Tamers, there's an episode where all the parents invite all the kids over for dinner. And the kids are like, oh, here we go. Oh, no. And so they all get around. They're all nervous. They're all looking at each other. And the parents say, okay, we've all been talking. We all want you to know we love you. We care for you. We know what you have to do. We may not be thrilled with it, but we want to be supportive of you. Do what you have to do. And if you need anything, let us know. And that's it.
Wow.
And the kids are like, oh, thank you. And that's, and then they move on from there. And so the adults are much more supportive and much more of helpers than in other shows. Like Harry Potter is a good example, where the adults are always getting in the way of the kids, right? Which adds tension, but it can become a little silly when it's the 5th Harry Potter novel and Harry's saved the world 5 times and still no one will pay attention to him. They'll listen to what he's saying. Again, easy drama, but it can sometimes be a little over the top. So
that's me at my daily work.
Exactly. Hey, Kaiser.
Hey.
Talking about Digimon, actually.
The genres that anime does best. Now, there's certain aspects of things like alternate worlds, universes, spiritual ghosts, paranormal, that anime, because it has that flexibility and the previous history, can really get into, where, of course, live action, you go back and watch the movie Ghost and it feels very dated. So some of the things that require effect, so anything requiring an effect, we covered would be done really well. What about things like mystery or maybe romance?
Obscure joke. So mystery is one of the things that I think anime doesn't do as well as other mediums do. I think it does it fine. There's certainly plenty of good mystery shows.
But it doesn't thrive.
It doesn't thrive. You look at British mysteries are just amazing. They do a really good job with mysteries. Anime does okay, but it's not the same. Stuff like that. Now, Eric in the chat room, would you call Yu-Gi-Oh! A kid show even with all the dark themes in it? Yes.
Dark
I absolutely would. Because you can absolutely do that in anime in Japan. You can do dark stuff.
Well, we used to do dark stuff with Grimm's fairy tales. You read through those. Those are pretty gruesome. If you were a kid listening to that,
and we're talking the original Grimm's fairy tale, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, kids, you're gonna be eaten. What?
Oh yeah. And by the way,
we'll keep you in a cage till you're bony. What?
There are versions, by the way, of Little Red Riding Hood that are not so much gruesome as about more adult topics. Shall we say?
Yeah, there's certain themes that but we've gotten out of the habit of telling those stories to kids, at least in popular culture. But anime goes there.
Well, and getting back to Tamers again, one of the underlying themes of that show that the writer said was, we do our children a disservice when we do not talk to them about death. We don't have to bring it up all the time.
Yeah, but
this needs to be addressed with kids at some point, at some age appropriate level. And so they have one of the characters die in that series. Fully, completely cannot be brought back. And they had characters deal with that. That's a major part of the show. So you do certainly see that in anime. They're willing to deal with that much more often than we are over here.
So there's an educational aspect to it, a learning and growing and developmental aspect to anime, which I I really appreciate the slice of life and dialogues where people are working out their differences, especially when I see girls fighting over issues. I can see a growth and development of how they handle these struggles in their lives, and then all the guys who are working on their dating skills and the whole social aspect of high school and growing and going into the workplace and struggling with all that.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And which gets back to our point, which is that I think anime does do a good job with those aspects of growing up, those aspects of learning lessons and growing as people. And part of that gets to the fact that anime series are structured differently, right? You have 26, 13, 50 episodes. You don't have X number of seasons. You don't have iCarly, which just goes on season after season, and nothing, not against that show. It's just that when you have a constant run of new episodes, you can't change your characters that much. And if you want syndication, that becomes more complicated too. So it becomes harder to show character growth when you may have hundreds of episodes than in a show when after 50 episodes you're out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. We've been going on for about an hour. We want to thank you all very much for joining us. I think that pretty well covers the topic. We've been talking here about genres in anime and all of that, and what genres anime does best. And if you have thoughts, please share them in the comments. Next week, we'll be talking about a kind of interesting topic in terms of something that's, I think, going to generate some discussion. Who is the next Hayao Miyazaki?
Passing the torch.
Exactly.
You mean there's going to be a retirement?
Well, Hayao Miyazaki is on his, I think, 7th retirement at this point. He just keeps announcing his retirement, and but
eventually it's going to happen.
Eventually it's going to happen.
Somebody's going to have to fill those shoes. Who will it be?
Yeah. Will there be a new?
Will there be?
Does somebody have to fill those shoes?
A battle to the end.
And I think that is the deeper question: is there going to be a new Hayao Miyazaki? And if so, who would it be? But how do we define the next Hayao Miyazaki? What are those attributes?
Tune in next week.
Exactly.
Same time, same stations.
It's going to be interesting. I hope you join us. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.